Hello, I'm Carson Chan, the director of MoMA's Emilio Ambas Institute for the Joint Study of the Built and the Natural Environment. Welcome to the first episode of Material Worlds, a series of live discussions aimed at expanding our understanding of building materials, how they have profoundly altered the planet's ecosystems, how they are embedded in and shape social structures, and the efforts afoot to develop sustainable materials and material practices to ensure a just and sustainable future. This event is also the first event of the Ambas Institute, established through a generous gift from Emilio Ambas to MoMA, which sits on unceded indigenous land, specifically the homeland of the Lenape people. At the Ambas Institute, we see the displacement of the Lenape people as part of the long continuum of environmental and racial justice issues that urgently need to be addressed as we recognize how architecture and the very act of building has contributed to the ongoing climate crisis. The Ambas Institute was established this past summer as a platform for fostering dialogue, promoting conversation, and facilitating research about the relationship between the built and natural environment, with the aim of making the interaction between architecture and ecology visible and accessible to the wider public while highlighting the urgent need of ecological recalibration. We aim to raise awareness about the ways our habits have impacted the environment and to help people understand that to truly tackle the climate crisis, we need to adopt a collaborative approach that includes perspectives and knowledge from all communities, particularly those that have been historically marginalized. All of our programming will be available online with the aim to give open access to all those who are interested in our work. Tonight's discussion on mass timber construction will be followed by many upcoming sessions about other materials like concrete, earth, stone, plastic, and so on. The series and the Institute is still being shaped, and at the end of the session, a survey will be posted in the webinar's chat box to give you the opportunity to suggest upcoming session topics, Institute events, and potential collaborations. Both the Q&A and the chat functions will be enabled, so feel free to make comments and pose questions during the event. I would like to thank architect and Professor Lindsay Wickstrom, who has organized this series and who will be moderating each session. Lindsay, your commitment to a just and sustainable material future for architecture is inspiring, and I'm grateful that you have been a part of the Ambas Institute from the very beginning. Of course, I want to thank Martino Stierle, the Chief Curator of the Museum's Architecture and Design Department, whose trust and support has allowed the Institute to take root under his leadership. Thank you to my colleagues in the Architecture and Design Department, especially Paola Antonelli. Your warmth and guidance in the past months bear fruit in this and all of the Institute's programming. Special thanks is given to Dewi Tan, the Institute's research assistant, whose energy and enthusiasm has shaped the Institute since her arrival. Finally, before handing the spotlight to Lindsay, I would like to thank Emilio Ambas for his vision to found an institute about architecture and environment at MoMA at this critical point in time. Your deep investment in the topic and passion for research is at the heart of all our work here. Lindsay?
Thank you, Carson. And thank you everyone for joining this evening. I think the slideshow should come up shortly. Here we are. I'm very happy to launch Material Worlds with this first episode on mass timber. We think it's essential to be interrogating building materials at this time because the built environment is responsible for almost half of global greenhouse gas emissions, and it's not slowing down. The UN predicts that globally, a Manhattan's worth of floor area will be built every 2 weeks for the next 40 years. This carbon comes from both the energy used to operate buildings and the embodied energy, or the energy used to produce and transport materials. The type and volume of materials, their effectiveness and lifespan, and their wake, or landscapes of extraction, are implicated in this future projection. People working across global supply chains or living adjacent to them would tell you that certain materials are better for their long-term health than others. Materials are political, materials are cultural, sometimes they're spiritual. Material choice is the moment when we actively eliminate carbon from our palette. It's when existing or new values are affirmed or denied. Material choice is a vote. It's a vote for the factories, the working conditions, the trade agreements, and the forms of everyday life implied. Decisions at this scale profoundly impact the long-term health of citizens both local and global. In these moments of decision, we are all carbon brokers, negotiating between human needs and the earth itself, between humans and non-humans, present and future, here and elsewhere. Why mass timber as a starting point? Wood construction is ancient, but also evolving more rapidly than ever before. It's more carbon sequestering than any other structural material in existence. Mass timber presents a new way to build renewable, plant-based, urban density that is so essential to low carbon living. If mass timber is the future, we have some questions. How is the supply chain being built? Who will have access to healthy building materials like this? Who owns the forests that will provide the raw materials? Are there enough trees in the world to build the mass timber cities of the future? Is mass timber safe? Will mass timber improve or reduce deforestation and biodiversity? Are trees more valuable in the ground or as timber, as carbon sinks or carbon sequestration machines? And will carbon markets anticipate if this value shifts? And finally, how are Indigenous interpretations of forests critical to this transition? The reason we have so many questions about materials is that we hope there will be a dramatic divergence in the way we view and use resources from the last 500 years. To quote a friend of mine, Jerome Hayford, "Normal is what got us here." From the perspective of forests, this is especially profound. The last 500 years of Eurocentric power produced specific imaginaries of nature, value, virtue, and therefore personhood. From the papal bull Dum Diversas in 1452, declaring moral authority to vanquish native flora, fauna, and persons into, quote, perpetual servitude, unquote, to the book Silva, published in 1664, that framed forests without Cartesian improvement as abandoned places, to the ongoing practice of imagining forests as wilderness in the form of national parks, as opposed to occupied and cultivated indigenous landscapes. Today, building materials come from colonized landscapes. The modern built environment is a derivative of this inherited cultural and spiritual projection of nature. So to rebuild or even imagine equitable, non-extractive living environments for humans and non-humans, the supply chain for materials and therefore mass timber, its underlying protocols for cultivation and making, moving, using, and reusing must be formed through new, more pluralistic imaginaries. In buildings, mass timber benefits not only occupants, but construction workers. It's faster, safer, quieter, cleaner. It can reduce stress. It's thermally efficient. It's hygienic. Even with such performative characteristics, the assembly of materials must remain persuasive and beautiful in its architectural expression. Architect Chandra Robinson will join us to share her experience designing buildings that serve many purposes, including strengthening communities and creating new forms of value for future generations. Right now, and depending on the region, mass timber is assumed to be about 10% more expensive than typical construction methods because typical methods are by definition entrenched. And when Black, Indigenous, and communities of color are systematically separated from landscapes and architecture that are healthy and wealth producing, typical methods risk the continuation of exclusivity. Equity-driven developer Anjali Halova will share with us how her role requires a whole new level of choreography across stakeholders throughout the supply chain. Her dedication to this emerging expertise is what makes accessibility possible. Mass timber for the last 30 years has been designed to rely on only a few tree species. If future cities are plant-based and certified through the building code using only a few species, does this not incentivize a reduction in biodiversity or, in fact, monocultures? We are joined today by Dr. Peggy Clouston, who is leading the effort to biodiversify mass timber on the East Coast using trees that are regional. She will share her research on the challenges of certifying organic building components. Ultimately, planning a forest for the future engages the complexities of public and private ownership and stewardship as forests span many generations. They require enormous acts of diplomacy an assessment of bias in new but necessary technology. Today, we're joined by the President of the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, Francois Dufresne, who will share more about the rapidly evolving process for ethical sourcing, framing the forest as an essential infrastructure, and how Indigenous interpretations of the forest are being recentered as a means of survival. And with that, I would like to welcome Francois.
Thank you, Lindsay. So, good evening. And first, I would like to thank the Museum of Modern Arts and the Emilio Ambas Institute for inviting me to be part of this panel tonight. I'm really honored to be here and to provide some insight on the crucial importance of responsible sourcing for mass timber. As Lindsay said, I've worked with the Forest Stewardship Council for the last decade as president of FSC Canada, and more recently as the interim president of FSC US, which offers me a unique perspective of the forest sector in North America. But also, as equally important to me, I'm also a forester. And that's where I would like to begin my story, in the forest. I have always been passionate about forests, and I feel stronger now than ever that we must maintain the integrity of this incredible natural resource. So let's begin tonight in a forest in my own province of Quebec, Canada. Chibougamau is 650 miles due north of New York City, in the heart of the boreal forest. The forest itself is dominated by the black spruce, a hardy coniferous species only found in North America with an impressive rate of renewal. But also, important to know, it's a dense material, making it an excellent for structural applications. For over 50 years, Chantier Chibougamau has served as a cornerstone of this forest community. They pride themselves on responsible forestry. Last year, actually, they were the first to transition to the FSC Canada's new National Forest Management Standard, working closely with elders and trappers in the local Cree First Nation. Chantier Chibougamau balances industry needs with the Indigenous people's traditional way of life, while also protecting critical habitat for rare and endangered species like the woodland caribou that you can see on the picture on this slide. Chantier Chibougamau is the parent company of Nordic Structures, a leading innovator in wood products used in mass timber construction. Nordic Structures supply the wood for the Alberta project, an award-winning residential complex in nearby Montreal, where I live. Last year, Alberta was the world's largest complex of its kind, built with mass timber. Other innovative examples of FSC certified mass timber projects in the US and around the world include the Michigan State University STEM building, the Bullitt Center in Seattle, the Formula One Grand Prix paddock here in Montreal, and also in Europe, the Bird Modular Treehouse in the dense forest in the mountain of Austria. It's a great treehouse project that you can find in the magazine Friesen. Now, this is a bit of a complex slide. It's funny to think of the use of wood in construction as a true innovation, when it's been used to build dwellings for centuries. But what is innovative is the way we use the wood, and our understanding about how certain timber can be more environmentally friendly option. This graph illustrates why sustainable source wood is a better option in construction versus steel and concrete. The line above the horizontal axis means that the material is actually emitting carbon. And below the horizontal line axis, it is sequestering carbon. You clearly see from this graph that not all wood is actually doing that, sequestering carbon. The dotted line near the top shows that timber design that you see there, worst case scenario, sourcing and transport, meaning it comes from deforestation and transported from a long distance, is almost as carbon intensive as concrete design. In contrast, the best case sourcing at the bottom from responsibly managed forests close to the construction site is beneficial from a carbon perspective. So not all wood is good. And Alberta, that I mentioned before with Nordics, is a great example of this best case scenario. So therefore, the main takeaway from this graph is that mass timber can only be considered climate smart when it comes from a responsibly managed forest. Now, let's switch to the human impact. The UN estimates that 68% of the world's population will live in urban centers by 2050, making it the pivot toward responsibly sourced mass timber in construction critical. Critical to our fight against climate change and to support the housing need of a growing global population and the trend of urbanization. But some may ask, how is wood or mass timber a better option in construction when the degradation of our world's forests is a key contributor to the climate crisis, as Lindsay mentioned at the beginning of this talk? It is true, forests are a natural climate solution. They absorb 1/3 of the global CO2 emissions every year. Forests are also home to over 80% of the terrestrial biodiversity, support soil and water quality, and provide us with the air we breathe. But when managed responsibly, forests are also, in my belief, the most amazing renewable resource on our planet. And that's where FSC comes into play. Established in 1994, in response to failed agreement to stop deforestation at the Earth Summit in Rio, the Forest Stewardship Council, or FSC, is the world's most trusted responsible forest certification system. FSC provides an independent assurance that the wood you buy supports forests that are managed to the highest standards. What makes FSC unique is an open and member-led democracy. That brings together a global community from diverse backgrounds with different interests with an equal voice, including industry, environmental group, communities, and also Indigenous people, as is the case in Canada. No other forest certification system does this. FSC creates a forum that allows for the co-creation of robust solutions of our world's forests. Forest companies must adhere to these requirements to become FSC certified. To protect and to maintain our integrity at FSC, it is absolutely critical. For this reason, FSC has started to use blockchain recently to record keeping technology aimed to improve the integrity of our supply chain. This technology further supports our efforts to keep certified supply chains strong and free from fraudulent claims. Unfortunately, this is a new phenomenon. Now, just last month, the first agreement to come out of COP26 in Glasgow was yet another commitment to halt deforestation Our standards around the world have always prohibited illegal logging and deforestation, which continues to be an important now as it was in 1994 when FSC started. FSC requires forest managers to uphold free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, a key feature of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. Now, let's be sure that we are the only forest certification system to implement UNDRIP. FSC also requires landowners to protect habitat for rare, threatened, and endangered species. In Canada, one such species is the iconic woodlands caribou. FSC requires the protection of its habitats because science has demonstrated that when caribou are in good health, the rest of the biodiversity mechanism of the forest is also in good shape. Here again, we are the only certification system implementing the protection of the woodlands caribou habitat in Canada. And the US market has an impact on the boreal and the woodland caribou, as a lot of mass timber used in the US come from the Canadian boreal. These, alongside the many other requirements, have a positive impact on carbon sequestration and storage. EcoTrust, a sustainability group in Oregon, found that FSC certified forests stored on average 30% more carbon than forests managed to legal requirements alone in Oregon and Washington. This means that using FSC certified wood from these regions translate into a climate benefit on the landscape. We are now expanding research of the impact of FSC practices on forest carbon to many other regions in North America, including California, Louisiana, and 2 sectors of the Canadian boreal forests, west to east. Globally, FSC can be found in 80 countries and with over 230 million hectares of certified forests. Our goal is to increase our global reach to 300 million hectares by 2030 and to continue our mission to offer forest solutions to the climate crisis worldwide. And here, this is where the story becomes impactful. FSC gives power to the people to drive positive change for forests through our market-driven system. When you see the FSC label on our products, which can range from clothing to book to yoga mat to furniture and more, and certainly mass timber, you can trust that they come from a responsible managed forest. For the interested audience, such as architects, designers, and developers tonight, FSC has some great resources available, including first, the FSC project certification, which certifies that forest-based material are deforestation-free and allows you to promote and to get credit for your sustainability sourcing choices. Second, our timber guide, as mentioned earlier, a species library created by FSC Denmark that profiles over 250 lesser-known timber species from FSC certified forests. This guide was created to help expand the market and relieve the pressure on well-known timber species, which can be overused. You can find that at lesserknowntimberspecies.com. And finally, we often hear that it's challenging to find FSC certified solid wood supply in North America. This should not be the case. So we launched the FSC Build with FSC.org. A one-stop destination for US, Canadian, and Mexican construction markets, which with over 700 suppliers. We just started that a couple of years ago, and we aim to pass the 1,000 supplier mark by next year. So when you specify FSC, in your projects, you drive demand for responsibly sourced timber, which forces the whole value chain to expand their sustainable footprint and allows us at FSC to certify more forest area. And this helps ensuring the resiliency of our forests worldwide. Together, we can protect the future of forests for generations to come. Thank you. Back to you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Francois. I think next up we'll have Peggy Clouston.
Hi, everybody. Just pulling my screen up. Should all be able to see it now. Well, first, I'd like to thank the UNEP Institute and Lindsay for inviting me to talk this evening. I'm truly delighted to talk with you about construction with mass timber. I'll do that actually by way of example with this state-of-the-art mass timber structure, the John Olver Design Building at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I'm one of the fortunate ones here who has an office and lab in this building. I'm very proud to say that I was one of the driving forces behind making this timber frame structure. So I'd like to tell you about how this building came to be and then explain why mass timber was used here. But also, as Lindsay mentioned at the outset, I'd also like to show you some of the groundbreaking research that my group is doing on using New England species to make mass timber. So let me start by telling you a bit about the building itself. It's one of the first buildings of its size in the US to be framed with mass timber. It was completed in late 2016 when there were only about 30 mass timber buildings here. Now there are over 1,000, either built or in the planning stages. This particular building has won 17 architecture and engineering awards, some of them extremely prestigious, like Building of the Year Award by World Architects. And it's really known worldwide. I give tours to people from places like Japan and Australia, Finland. My program is building and construction technology. It's housed here together with the departments of architecture and landscape architecture and regional planning. This is my lab here off to the right. Our research and courses all focus on how to build more sustainably, and using wood in the construction of the building was a major part of that. But it almost wasn't wood. Interesting story. Myself and a colleague, Alex Schreier, he's over here in the photo, showing students some of the staircase details. We were both strong advocates for mass timber from the start. We tried our best from a bottom-up approach to convince the design team to use wood, but it didn't work. In fact, there were understandably concerns for cost overruns with timber being a new unfamiliar technology to the team. It wasn't until I brought in the political heft and willpower of former Congressman John Olver, he was able to secure a $3 million contingency fund for it. And it became then a demonstration building. And that was really the turning point that made it wood. Our vision for the building was that as a demonstration structure, it would spur others like it and essentially help us to make, well, 3 points really. First, that mass timber is feasible for this size of building. Second, that it's more environmentally friendly than steel and concrete. And third, and this one's important, that a wood building of this stature could help reinvigorate our own local forest industry. The thought of having a market for local trees and one day using our own tree species to build such a building, that was the vision. In fact, the building was built with black spruce from the Nordic engineered wood products company that Francois mentioned. So I'm happy to say that the building is succeeding in all three of these accounts. I'll circle back to these points in a moment, but first, here are some quick images. These are students getting up close and personal with the main attraction, the zipper truss. This is the student's view into the atrium. We like to call this the Kodak photo spot in the building if you're ever visiting. On top of this beautiful truss is a rooftop garden with indigenous trees and plants. This garden was part of the landscape architecture wish list to demonstrate intensive and extensive green roofs. Just a fun fact, the garden was actually voted the #1 dating spot on campus. And here are some students hanging out in the Post and Bean Cafe. Clever name. I wish I could take credit for it, but the students came up with that. As you can see, the columns are exposed, so the structure itself is the finishing material. And that's one of the great things about mass timber, is that it can be exposed like this without fire protective coating. In traditional steel and concrete buildings, or even light wood frame construction, the structure is hidden behind gypsum or fireproofing. These big wood beams and panels and columns, they easily meet the 2-hour fire rating per the building code. And that's because large sections of wood are inherently fire resistant. They don't catch fire easily. If you think of a campfire, for example, we start with kindling, small pieces, and the large pieces that we put on are the last to catch. When they finally do catch, they burn slowly at a predictable rate. They char on the outside, and that char forms this insulating layer that protects the structural integrity of the inner core of the beam. If you look at this chart and compare wood to steel when under extremely high temperatures, just after 20 minutes being exposed to extreme heat, steel only retains about 25% of its strength, but wood beams retain almost 75%. In this image, you can see the aftermath of a fire in a building that was constructed with large timber beams on the first floor and steel beams up on the second, but after the fire, the steel beams collapsed and came down on top of the wood beams. So you can see the metal pretty badly twisted here. So steel needs to be fire protected, but mass timber, because of its size, does not. Another interesting, somewhat surprising point to many is that wood is frequently preferred in buildings with high humidity, like for swimming pool enclosures, for example. Getting to the question of wood's durability, wood rot only happens if it's triggered, which means under specific conditions. And those conditions are when the wood is exposed to high moisture for a prolonged time with moderate temperatures, and the wood hasn't been treated with preservative chemicals. The moisture content has to be over 19% for those wood techies out there. When wood is used indoors and or it's designed properly, it will last as long as any other building material. So why use mass timber in particular for the design building? It had to do with sustainable design. That's top of the list. Studies have shown that mass timber buildings are carbon sinks, putting it simply. When the amount of carbon sequestered by the forest during the photosynthesis process, and then that carbon is stored in the wood, when this is compared to the amount emitted during the manufacture of wood products, including transportation and installation into the structure, more carbon is stored in the wood than is emitted. I like to think of these big buildings as carbon storage tanks in a way to offset climate change. But it's also about reducing pollution. So life cycle assessment studies, they've shown, many of them in fact, in recent years, that in every category of cost to the environment, like global warming potential, acidification, and so on, wood products have a smaller environmental footprint than steel and concrete, shown here in green. In some cases, like ozone depletion and eutrophication, it's 5 to 6 times less. So it's truly a substantial difference from steel and concrete to wood. Specifically for the design building, an environmental building declaration was done. It was done based on comparing a steel frame to a mass timber frame. You can read about it in the online pamphlet. There's the link down here. In that pamphlet, there's also a carbon summary that shows the total potential carbon benefit of using wood in the building. That was equivalent to taking just over 500 cars off the road for a year. It's not a huge number, but I like to think at least it's going in the right direction, not putting more cars on the road. So also building with wood is about keeping forests healthy, as Francois was mentioning earlier. Market incentives pay for critical silvicultural practices like thinning and replanting. In the face of climate change especially, we need these activities to reduce risk of forest fire. Tree infestation by pests and land conversion. Urban sprawl, for example, is a major issue, and development is the largest threat to forests here in New England. A recent Harvard study showed that we're losing 67 acres per day to development. So keep forests as forests. This is the mantra, similar to what Francois was saying. Mass timber is also about healthy working and living spaces. This is the architecture studio in the design building. I can tell you it smells wonderful in there. Recent studies are showing how being surrounded by wood in our work and living areas can provide biophilic benefits, like reducing stress levels and so on. And the prefab aspect of mass timber makes construction incredibly fast. This is a time-lapse video of almost the entire south wing of the first floor being constructed in one day. The columns are lifted into place, and then the beams rest in pockets there, and then the floor plates rest right on top of those beams, and so on. And it's also very high-tech. These large beams and columns are cut using computer numerically controlled, or CNC machinery, to get extreme precision so that pieces fit together quickly and easily. There's really no way of being able to align all of the holes between the wood and the steel without CNC machinery. Construction workers say that it's like putting together a large Lego set. So shifting base a little, remember that one of the main reasons to use mass timber in the over design building was to help reinvigorate our own forest industry. Well, that's what my group is currently working on in the lab. This is a photo of some of my grad students showing off a prototype panel that we made from trees grown in Massachusetts. This work is important because although we have an abundance of trees here in New England, there are no mass timber plants here. The closest one is the one that Francois mentioned in northern Quebec, Chibougamau. Many of our trees here in southern New England especially are small diameter. A small diameter is not good for dimensional lumber, like 2x12s, but they can be used in wood composites. If you look very closely at the columns in the design building, you'll see that the full column is made of 1x2 sticks of black spruce from northern Quebec. And as Francois mentioned, extremely tight grained, very dense, good quality wood for building. And this kind of information bodes really well for some of our own local tree species. So to this end, in 2018, my research group was funded by the Massachusetts government, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. We worked on establishing the structural feasibility of using eastern hemlock and eastern white pine specifically, separately as lamstock and cross-laminated timber, CLT for short. The lumber came from Western Massachusetts and Southern Vermont. So here's Boston. Here's where we got most of the lumber and a little bit of it from Sirsosimo in Vermont. Here's a brief video to show you how the panels were made in our lab. It took 3 people about 20 minutes to set up a 3-layer panel and about 30 minutes for a 5-layer panel, all within the working time of the adhesive. And then we strength test them to make sure they meet engineering standards. This is another video. Keep your eyes on this spot here. We put them into a testing machine and load them up until they break to measure their engineering properties. And then we publish, because that's what we do at the university. The results are summarized in this journal paper that came out last year. We tested some 30 panels in total. And here's the carnage over here. And we found that comparing the results to the 7 established grades for cross-laminated timber, these are made from species like spruce, pine, and fir. Well, hemlock works quite well, but pine not so well. These are the 3 most important engineering properties. And in particular, the one in the middle for pine at 700 is just slightly higher than the smallest of all the others. So it can still be used, but it might not span as far or carry as heavy loads. So we're currently working on putting Eastern hemlock into an actual building. Northeast State Forest Association was awarded a Wood Innovations Grant, and it was specifically to put Eastern hemlock in a 5-story multifamily structure. We're getting closer towards that goal. We're in the process of getting the product code approved. And by product, I mean 3-layer all the way up to 9-layer panels. And by doing so, once we get it into the building, we'll have a case for a Northeast mass timber fabricator. So I've been part of a regional dialogue in incentivizing mass timber in New England, both from a supply and demand perspective. The dialogue was underwritten by Climate Works Foundation and the Climate and Land Use Alliance, and it involved state representatives from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Eastern New York, and Vermont. And if you have interest and time, I highly recommend you check out the report and webinar we created. You can find the link on the screen right here. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll hand it back to Lindsay to continue.
Thank you, Peggy.
You bet.
All right, next we have Aniele Halova.
Thank you, Lindsay. I want to make sure you can see that. Yes, thank you. So my name is Aniele Halova, and I'm a real estate developer in Portland, Oregon. And today I'm going to discuss 4 projects in Portland that demonstrate innovation in mass timber construction. 3 in my role as a real estate developer, and the 4th one as a client during the renovation of my house. So the project framework was intended to be the first high-rise building made from wood in the United States. Framework in 2015 was the winner of the $1.5 million Tall Wood Building Prize, which was intended to kind of fund the innovation needed to prove out this technology. So, you know, in retrospect, when I look back, really this project was 2 different projects. One was an R&D project to prove out the technology, which included strict fire, seismic, and acoustic testing, stricter than in what's needed in Europe and in Canada, where high-rise buildings have already been built. The second component of the project is really a real estate development project, and this building was intended to have offices for B corporations and affordable housing. And so the results from the R&D project were tremendous, and they also went into changing the International Building Code to allow for high-rise construction throughout the United States. Some of the intents behind the R&D were obviously to prove out the technology at a large scale, to increase demand for mass timber products in the US, to inspire future innovations, which we've seen a lot since 2015, and then to create a whole new industry of sustainable jobs in the United States. And part of pushing the demand side of the industry required our team at this moment to make a really big commitment, which we did. And the intent behind this project was to build the majority of it out of US manufactured mass timber products. You have to understand that this commitment was made prior to there being any companies in the United States that even fabricated this product for a building of any scale. And so since then, we have companies like D.R. Johnson in Oregon that are producing this product at scale. And so really this project was kind of on the visionary bleeding edge of thinking about mass timber. And one of the unique aspects of this project really on the human side was it was really a pairing of environmentalists who, you know, came more with an urban perspective with logging, forestry, manufacturing industry really coming in with a rural perspective. And so a lot of people might ask, you know, how does such an innovative project come to be? I can't underestimate the importance of a team in this type of project. First of all, we had an impact investor, a client who really cared about advancing this new technology, about carbon sequestration benefits. This was intended to be a resilient building, which Chandra will talk about from Lever after me. And then really our client cared about rural manufacturing jobs. So we had that. And then from the development side, you know, a developer, which was me as a partner of my former company project, assembling a team of like-minded companies, the whole architecture and engineering team who were passionate about the environment and building innovation. And then, prior to the International Building Code changes, Framework needed a jurisdiction that would work with us to create a pathway and criteria for approval. And we were able to find that in the state of Oregon. And so while the R&D project was a huge success, unfortunately, the real estate part of the project went on pause due to changes in the economy at that time. Given that, some of the innovations that were really steeped in this idea of triple bottom line, so environment, economy, and the social aspects were not really fully realized. And some of those social outcomes were the affordable housing, spaces for B corporations, and the idea that the building would be built with a high percentage of minority, women, and emerging small businesses. This is a diagram that kind of talks about that forest to frame concept, with the tall wood building being a catalyst for that in the United States. And I kind of highlighted in different colors, one of the things that we're seeing now in the other projects that I'm going to talk about is really that emphasis on these new jobs that are going to have been formed and will be formed in the future. And so quite a few of our team members went on to a project after Framework, which is the Nature Conservancy's headquarters in Oregon. And it's a renovation of a 3-story wood frame 40-year-old building with an addition of a 1-story structure that you can see in the foreground. It's a LEED Gold certified project, and this project was really about utilizing and sourcing regional woods. And with the idea that this project the building connects you to place, the place being Oregon, and that it enabled the Nature Conservancy to better do their work in the space. Some of their work involves reducing greenhouse gas emissions, advancing collaborative forest restoration, and in developing innovative approaches to habitat protection. So you can imagine that type of work happening in a building that's actually did that. And so that connection to regional materials, be it Oregon juniper, domestically fabricated CLT, and cedar, and then a lot of the landscape elements, the plantings, boulders, river rock, and then also the timber used in the decking were actually sourced from the Nature Conservancy's regional conservation projects. So that provided an opportunity for staff and then visitors who come and learn about this building to connect this building in an urban environment to the actual work they're doing in the field. And that kind of connection was helped and facilitated through a nonprofit called Sustainable Northwest, and really thinking about how do we source these materials in a sustainable manner, thinking about the supply chain and where that material is coming from. And this is an example showing the CLT being put into place into what is now the Vernier Community Room, which is a big part of the Nature Conservancy's new program that they could do in this building that they couldn't do in their prior, their unrenovated building, which was really bringing together environmental and conservation organizations together to kind of tackle these kind of regional challenges within the context and kind of reminding you about that region. And so the next project that, some of our team members, I would say from Framework, went on to Nature Conservancy and then on to Meyer Memorial Trust. Meyer Memorial Trust is one of Oregon's largest foundations, and their giving and how they give to projects and programs is really prioritizing equity in the workforce with a high commitment to sustainability. And what was great about this project was really a focus on creating a replicable model for commercial development. So a lot of times people think of, foundation work as, they can just throw as much money toward it and create kind of this either like a jewel or, and there's really important parts about being a demonstration project, but they want it to be a demonstration project while also being able to be replicable in the market rate. And so we were fortunate enough on this project to have a visionary client that gave our team the ability to realize this wood innovation goals that we had. So the building is a 20,000 square foot office building, LEED Platinum certified. It has two parts. One is a 3-story wood framed building that has actually, you can't see it, but on the sloped ends has solar panels, and a 1-story convening space made from a new mass timber product called mass plywood panels, MPP. And that's an innovative wood product homegrown in Lyons, Oregon. And so the wood is showcased in certain areas of the building, including this feature stair and then the convening space, which is named the Center for Great Purposes. In this woodwork, Meyer had specific goals, and they dealt with supporting rural forestry based jobs, supporting rural communities, and then also supporting innovation in Oregon, all within the context of increasing BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and women-owned businesses in the work that they did. And so they decided, in partnership with Sustainable Northwest, who I mentioned before was working on the Nature Conservancy project, to come up with their own definition of sustainable wood. And one of the reasons they did that was in thinking about equity. And so the criteria that they used is, first, they wanted to source wood products from rural, tribal, or minority women and emerging small businesses. Second, prioritizing FSC certified wood. And then third, prioritizing wood products from the region. And they did that through a system which was sort of like green, yellow, red, being like how does it meet this criteria with regard to sustainability? And this was a lot of work. This was almost like its own project out, you could pull it out of the rest of the project. And the question is, why did we do all that work? On one hand, we could have said, let's make this 100% FSC certified. And we would have done that and called it a day and said, we're meeting our sustainable wood criteria. What Meyer actually wanted to do was, they wanted to do two things. One is they wanted to get more BIPOC businesses involved in the manufacturing and supply of the products, and exposure to the mass timber industry. And then two, we wanted to have as least of a premium cost-wise as we possibly could, because there's a lot of pushback, on market rate development that says if you specify certification at any level, you're increasing premiums. And so kind of triangulating, the equity goals with the sustainability goals with the economic goals, we were able to get 50% of the wood products supplied by BIPOC businesses, 85% of the wood meeting their definition of sustainable wood, with only a 3% premium. And, there were some areas where we could have gone higher, let's say, on the sustainable wood, but we decided to prioritize wood innovation in that case. And so really kind of looking at all the goals of the project. And talking about kind of those equity goals, overall, the project was really going toward how do we maximize and minority women and emerging small business is a way to certify a company in the state of Oregon. And so we had a goal of, you can see from this chart, of 43% of the businesses in the cost of the building going toward minority and women-owned businesses. And we were actually able to achieve 47%. And so when we think about equity, specifically in sustainability, sustainability was always intended to be a three-legged stool where you have the environment, the economics, and the social. And I believe, especially at this point in my career, that projects should not be considered sustainable if they don't have and they don't meet equity goals. As a result of all of this, this project has received 9 awards, including a USGBC Leadership Award and an FSC Leadership Award. And I've been able to see in a very short time, just giving presentations about this project in our local development industry here, has actually caused real estate developers to make equity goals on projects, across their whole entire company that they hadn't even considered equity before. And so I'm going to end with a personal project of mine. During this time, I was renovating a 100-year-old home, prairie-style home in Portland. And there was a point at which I was thinking about doing an exterior kind of indoor-outdoor space. And we decided on doing this covered cabana. This covered cabana actually has been my conference room during the pandemic times. I didn't know how valuable indoor-outdoor space was. we had never actually intended to use CLT. I think a lot of times people don't think of CLT and residential development coming together. But when we actually started pricing out alternatives and exploring it, this actually proved to be the most affordable option with getting that kind of seamless, streamlined, modern look to it. So I think we should think about this product in kind of innovative ways that maybe we haven't thought about it before. And so sort of my take home ideas and thinking about mass timber are, it's really important to have a team of like-minded members. We really have to, in the larger projects, think about mass timber from the beginning of the project. It's not something you can think about kind of after the fact. You kind of have to commit and then work through that process. Because this is a new industry, a lot of us have had to put a lot of time and kind of sweat equity into advancing this industry, which I think is important. And then the whole point, on the true sustainability is to use this new industry as an opportunity to bring BIPOC and women-owned businesses into the building sector in this new sustainable sector. And so basically mass timber building should be the opportunity that allow us to physically manifest our values, both sustainability and equity, especially racial equity, and think about how are buildings being designed, where is the building material coming from, who will make these buildings, and then who will benefit from their making. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. Next, as our concluding presenter, Chandra Robinson.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to pull up my screen here. And just to let folks know, I will be sharing some information on the same projects as Anjali because we have worked together on them, but I'm sharing them from the perspective of an architect rather than a developer. I'm Chandra from Lever Architecture, and our office is here in Portland, Oregon. We also have another office in LA that we just started, but having sort of started here in Oregon, which is timber country, it's really no surprise that many of our projects feature locally sourced exposed timber structures. Many of the things that we work on, that we design, are first of their kind wood projects that are using both stock glulam's, mass timber products, and also reuse of timbers to create new structural members. And then on to next generation wood technologies, FSC certified CLT, mass plywood, and hybrid structures. And so over the last 11 years, we've grown a lot, not just in our design work, but also in the research and the innovation that goes into that work and that inspires that work. And so one example of that is our early work using mass plywood, which is a product that's only made here in Oregon. And this is a pavilion that we created as part of the exhibition we designed for John Yon in the Portland Art Museum. And really using this material was a way to kind of explore what it can do, what it looks like, what it feels like, what kinds of shapes it makes. And so we went on from that pavilion to still work with that same manufacturer and use their product to create a few more pavilions that were then shown at the mass timber conferences that were held here in Portland. And really, again, it's exploration of all of these materials, right? What are the things it can do? It can be sharp, it can be soft, and just really thinking about what quality of space is created from this. So why do we want to do that, right? For us, this is a local product. Both the wood and the products that are created for it are sourced right here in our region. It creates really beautiful spaces that feel good to be in. I know Peggy talked about biophilia, and really when you think about biomorphic forms and patterns, like you're seeing it right here. Material connection to nature, again, you're seeing it right here. It really allows people to take focus off what they're doing in a space, maybe look at the materials, maybe look at outside, and it really does bring some calm and create less stress and anxiety than other types of spaces can. And thinking about, these products creating this beautiful space, like you look at mass timber, and I know in the chat it came up, what exactly is mass timber, right? So it is an engineered wood product. It's made of much smaller pieces. This is the mass plywood, so a lot of lamellas are in here. That also means that there's a lot of adhesive. And that adhesive, I think people have been worried about, but manufacturers are working towards using more sustainable mixes with low VOCs, and some of the local mass timber manufacturers that we work with are already using Green Guard certified products, Green Guard certified adhesives. So, thinking about these, and I'm just scrolling through a lot of the projects that we have done using stock or custom or hybrid structures. Just thinking about these again, Francois and Peggy talked about embodied carbon. When you're using products that are close to the project site, you're obviously reducing our need for fossil fuels. You're reducing emissions because the transportation is much shorter. Oftentimes, projects that are made with wood can be lighter. So the foundations, the concrete foundations, can sometimes be smaller and have less site work. And some projects like this one right here have been able to save 3 months in the construction schedule, and that is a huge cost driver. So when mass timber has a premium on it, that can also be offset by how much faster these buildings can be erected. And kind of looking at hybrid structures, right? It's most often not going to be all wood. It's going to be a combination of different things that are most efficient and quicker. So this project actually is a creation of a whole new mass timber product through our design. And it's a CLT double T. There are concrete double Ts that are out there, right? But this is a CLT double T that's created, and it doesn't have any steel connections. It just sits right into those corbels. So there's a lot of interesting things that you can look forward to, right? Everything's a hybrid and everything's an iteration. Another why, like Anjali said, she brought up this slide before. So this is forest to frame, which is a term we coined based around this idea and this diagram that we created, right? So it really is talking about the connection between the forest itself, the source, who is milling it and who is turning it into an engineered wood product. What buildings it's going into and how that impacts the entire city. So really for this project framework, it's really about a deeper engagement with the material landscape. We care about the whole cycle, who manages these forests, who's harvesting the forests, who's milling it, who's manufacturing it, all the way down to our engagement with it physically on the job site. And through that project, we did almost $1 million worth of testing, acoustic testing, structural testing, fire testing, and all of these things were really, the project was designed and fully permitted through the state, and it didn't go forward like Anjali said, but all of that work that was done here in this testing really helped lead to the new mass timber construction types being added to the 2021 IBC. And it was an early adoption in Oregon. So we were allowed to use that type for construction a year before. So current tall wood buildings are using the details that were designed through this, right? Because these are the details that were tested. This is structural testing in our engineer. And using this technology, this resilient wood rocking wall so that your cores are also wood, and this is a shake table test of just a 2-story, but we've been working on a 10-story that I think is going to be up and running and ready to test sometime next spring, maybe in 6 months or so. So all of this work, all of this research that we're doing and we're participating in, it really is pushing the industry forward. And this is the sort of framework diagram of the structure that's in there. But again, looking at this, I'm going to share with you our project Albina Yard, and that's the size of framework. And this new tower in Milwaukee that's being built, these are the projects that are using the details that were developed through framework, right? And that was really the intent of the project, open source, to give people a place to start to really make these move along. So now I'm going to share a couple of projects and then tell you what we're working on now in terms of research. So Albina Yard, that's our office. That's where I am right now. Albina Yard is the first building in the country made with domestically produced CLT. So it was produced here in Oregon. The wood was harvested here in Oregon, like 3 hours south of Mount Hood that you see in the distance. And this image is just so cool because all of that material really came from those forests way out in the distance. And they're right here on Albina. This is our building, timber structure, timber curtain wall, really beautiful interior, really warm and light, and is a great place to work. And once we started construction on it and realized how gorgeous the space was going to be, we decided that we had to move in. So here we are many years later. And this is the CLT stair. That's also really beautiful. And we have used this in Meyer as well, but using mass plywood and a little bit different structure system. So with Meyer Memorial Trust, as Anjali said, it was a big focus on sustainability and equity. And we really feel that equity and sustainability are linked because the folks who are most impacted by climate change are often people of color and people who are poorer, right? So when you think about sustainability, I also think about protecting the habitats, protecting the environments and the neighborhoods of people who are not my neighbors, right? They live many hours away, but I still care about the environment that they're in. So thinking about that, there are many products here. So looking back at this image, there's a hardwood forest. People think that Oregon is all Doug fir, but we have hardwood forests and we have flooring materials that actually came from these hardwood forests in Oregon. It's from a company that's run by a family who's been in Oregon a long time. And then thinking about the wood products that we use on the casework, all of that is locally and then has been installed by MWESB partners, minority women-owned emerging small businesses. This is looking into the Meyer building. So this is the mass plywood. Here is a roof panel that's flying in. We had a temporary roof put on it because it gets very rainy here sometimes. And we wanted to have a little bit of coverage of all of the structure that you see in here. But this really is the final product, right? This is the event space. It's called the Center for Great Purposes. And it really shows you that you can use something that's industrial and seems like it's rough, but you can do a little work on it and have it be really refined and humble and really showcase the innovation that's happening around you. This diagram kind of shows you where different wood products are in the building and where they were sourced from. So all of these that we're showing are FSC certified, not everything in the project was. But if you look at sort of the tall 3-story portion of the building, that is all traditional stick framed. And then the shorter part of the building is actually the mass timber construction. So that again was part of the equity story, was bringing in new partners who didn't have the experience in mass timber and maybe wouldn't have been successful in bidding on the project because of that. But by creating this hybrid structure, it allowed more people to be available to participate. So this is sort of the regional impact, right? All of these products coming from really close to the site, again, reduces carbon. So the last thing I want to talk about is related back to the framework project and forest to frame and also to Meyer. So as Anjali described, on Meyer, there was a sustainable wood sourcing criteria, definition for sustainable wood that was very specific to Meyer Memorial Trust and their goals and their mission and their values. What we are doing with this new wood innovation grant that we just won this year and we're very excited about is to actually create a tool to help people in the design and construction industry understand the sourcing a little bit better and understand the forest practices. So not everyone will have to repeat all of the research that we have done on these past projects, but create a tool that's, again, open source for everyone to use. There are some really interesting new models of forest management and harvesting that are happening, and visited some forests that are up in Washington State where it's land that's owned by the U.S. Forest Service, but the harvesting of the wood is done by a private company, and they do it to the specifications that the Forest Service has set up, right? The kind of thinning that happens, saving trees of a specific diameter, how much litter they can leave on the ground. And all of those things contribute to the health of the forests and contribute to reducing catastrophic fires. And it's this really like public and private partnership that is happening that creates these really great outcomes. And that also extends to tribal nations. There tribal nations on the West Coast who manage forests. And we are starting to discover the ways in which you can specify what forest you're trying to get the wood from, and you can actually find how to transport it to a specific mill that may be tribal owned, or a specific manufacturer that's close to you that makes the kind of products you want. So all of this work that we're doing is really important just to be able to push the industry forward and find all of these new paths, right? Find these new paths, and the intention is really just so that we can all make better choices as designers of the built environment, make better choices that actually impact everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I think we'll now all be in the spotlight together. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'm in complete heaven listening to your examples of projects and your initiatives, and I, you're all four of you are kind of redesigning and redefining the supply chain for the construction of cities from different points of view. And I wanted to kind of start with Chandra, because you're just kind of describing so many aspects of the things that we as architects consider when going into a project, and then including even more constraints, when you're trying to push forward or build new pathways for the industry. And I think, so this question comes from the senior curator of MoMA's Architecture and Design Department, Paola Antonelli. So you, and someone actually in the chat also mentioned how beautiful the stair was that you included in your deck, and along with a lot of the other spaces. I was wondering if you might speak to the role of beauty when we're trying to persuade new materials and new methods of construction to happen. We're trying to kind of convince someone to take a risk on something, and then beauty plays this really integral role in that conversation. And I wonder how those conversations might have happened in some of those spaces and buildings that you've worked on.
Well, that's a really good question. And I think a lot of times what we start out with is we're always thinking of what's happening around us, who's innovating, who's doing cool work around us, right? And so we think, oh, yes, we want to try mass plywood in this building. It's been used as a back of house thing, and something that gets covered up with gypsum. But looking at it, looking at the cut section, it's so cool that you're like, no, this can be a really spectacular space. And if we can just render that, right, that is what really gets people excited. And you absolutely do think about how beautiful something is going to be. If it wasn't, then it's something that would be covered up, right? But we really want to expose all of this structure that's in there. And I think that that it really does come first, because it's something that we need to get excited about, right? We think about what the client's values are, what they want in their building, what the programming is. And every building, we really want to sort of elevate your experience of just being here in the office, right? Being in a gorgeous space. And so selecting a material is really, the first step there, just imagining what you want the space to be. So I do think it's really important. And it's what gets the client excited. So, showing Anjali a rendering of something, describing it to her isn't going to get the same sort of level of excitement as showing her an image, right? And it's because Anjali and I have worked together a bunch, so that's why I'm pulling her out there on the same projects. But
and I failed to mention that all of the projects that I presented were done by Lever Architecture down to the home project. So they're definitely a leader in the architectural space on mass timber.
Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I think you're right. Beauty plays such an integral role, and it's kind of the initial conversation that might happen. And Peggy, you mentioned the kind of Kodak space where this material is not only being represented through the design process, through renderings and images and imagery and drawings, but also through photos and memory as we kind of come to the site and leave the site. What are your thoughts on beauty, Peggy?
I think it was part of what made the design building so well, the photos that are online of the design building are iconic. And I have to say that Alex Schreier, who's a colleague I mentioned in the presentation, was responsible for a lot of those construction photos. They were taken during the building going up, so we got some unique images. But you can see for the background behind me, that zipper truss is like building jewelry. It's the main attraction. People come in off the street who may not even have any interest in architecture whatsoever, but are just in awe of the way it's supporting a rooftop garden, but the beauty of it as well. So it really does engage folks who don't necessarily think much about buildings in the first place.
Yeah, I think that that's completely right. And I think this idea of beauty might even extend into the spaces that we're all describing beyond the construction site. I mean, but also the construction site itself as it's being built. Peggy, you had these amazing kind of time lapses, and watching mass timber buildings as they go up is also this kind of new aesthetic in progress, and the kind of capturing of that process in its in the kind of people who are involved, but also in its very short time frame and very quiet nature. It's this kind of new phenomenon, I think, in our cities. I wonder, I want to speak well, I have one question in addition to this question about beauty for the project that Anjali and Chandra worked on together and collaborated on, and then it grew into this open source digital commons that is related to BIPOC involvement, and this new definition, this new interpretation of sustainability. I think it's critical. This is what you're bringing to the industry, and it's the one of its kind that I know of, and I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your plans for this project. How do you imagine it growing, especially when you're thinking regionally and you're kind of collecting data? I think that it would be interesting to hear how something like this might migrate across this continent, but also as we start to move internationally. Maybe Anjali, do you want to start?
Yeah, I was gonna say I have a little bit of bias toward Oregon. And you know, when I moved here, we were like the lead, I would say we were the leaders in sustainability with regard to, like, you know, the first LEED certified, you know, this building and that building. And I think all of us who were involved in the green building industry, we went through that, and then that became a norm, right? And all of us around the time of framework were thinking about, well, what next, right? We're talking a lot about building systems, mechanical systems, a lot of additive effects, and not so much the actually what the building's made out of. And so I think it was within all of us, especially the equity part from years ago. But it's like on a commercial market rate building, it's really hard to just decide one day, I'm going to add this equity, you know, portion to my criteria for business. That's, I think, the unique role of having either client and or sponsors on these projects that's really going to take these things to the next level. And like I said, now I'm listening to market rate developers in Portland say this is our standard building practice as of this year. And I think 2020 Black Lives Matter, you know, put a spotlight on racial injustices and equity issues that have been happening since the founding of this country. And now I'm really excited to know that maybe it's the architectural world or the developer world that's really going to take a lead on create. And what we have is we have the ability to create concrete things, right? Like, and I don't mean out of concrete, but buildings that people can look at, and then we can describe the story. And I think that can spread the message further, I think, than probably a lot of other industries.
Yeah, and I would say I'm really excited about what these projects can do, because like Anjali explained, we worked with Sustainable Northwest really closely, but we also worked with the contractor, right? They have ties to everyone in the community, and between sort of all of us, we were able to find, like, what are all the different options for wood slat ceiling? What are, you know, FSC certified, or if we just know the forest it came from, or if we know the family who runs it, we know that it's a Black-owned business. and just find out all of that information. It's just data gathering, right? So that you have all of this and you can make those decisions. And yes, I think that has to extend obviously beyond where we are in the country. It has to expand all the way out and overseas, but it requires people who have this passion and this desire to do that research, who already have those relationships because they've procured materials before from these folks, and they can say, oh, can I ask you a few questions about, you know, the forest management or how workers are treated at this mill. It requires those relationships. Like I can't go across the country to New York City and then try and find, you know, where people are getting wood from. They don't know me, right? So they're not going to necessarily be willing to share that information. And so I think it's going to be a model, an easy tool to use, knowing that you can get this sustainable wood. It's not close to you necessarily, but it is a place for you to start and then to start building sort of larger tools. And I'm personally really excited about it because I can't wait until it gets to the point where I have a great list of Black-owned foresters and mills and mass timber manufacturing plants, because we're working on several projects in our historically Black neighborhoods in Portland, that I want to be able to bring those to these projects and say, like, look, this CLT came from a Black-owned business, or this forest is managed by a Black family, right? And that's really important to me, to be able to bring that level of detail and specificity to a project through this wood sourcing.
And I was going to mention on the policy side, you know, at the state of, I'm a commissioner on the Land Conservation and Development Commission, and we've sort of been given this task to do climate friendly and equitable rulemaking. We're like literally in that process right now. So every agency at the state is going to have to look at their policies, programs, funding from a racial justice equity lens. And there really hasn't yet been the connection between a lot of the carbon sequestration efforts that happen on forest and ag land yet to the carbon sequestration efforts happening in building. But I think it's coming.
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about where do you place the buildings, and then also what are they made out of, and then how do you operate them. And so I'm kind of excited on that kind of higher statewide policy level, and then energized by this actual specific building projects.
I think that's excellent. I think it connects a little bit to the question in the chat from Michael Chen, recommendations for sourcing. One maybe follow-up might be, you know, in the interim, as we're building this database and it's kind of slowly getting smarter and smarter and including more and more resources and distributed businesses, how might we today do that here on the East Coast and work towards eventually contributing to your tool? What are our best practices? Does that mean that we as architects drive out and explore forests?
No, it means that you work with your contractor. Whoever you have a good relationship with, who you've worked with a few times, you sit down and you talk with them and you say, I want to explore other sources. Like, tell me what's out there, because they're the ones who know who is making these products, right? So I think that's the first place to start. And that makes it easy because you're really relying on a relationship that you already have, and you're just asking for a little more information. Here's the first step that we're going to take to get in there. And yes, you can do research, but there's so much information out there, and I think the contractor is really going to be your best friend on this.
Yeah, well, that's a great recommendation. I'm struck by how central relationships are in all four presentations. The relationships among different fields and different colleagues in different fields, and also different kind of groups of people, like Francois. I think that, you know, you mentioned this integral kind of relationship with the First Nations group who is leading this effort. And I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit more how that relationship developed and how it came to light and where it might be going, or how that relationship became a model for forestry practice that you're kind of centering.
Well, thanks for the question, Lindsay. You know, in countries such as mine in Canada, there are 600 Indigenous communities, and 75% of them live close or in the forest. And often they are at the forefront of the impact of forest activities, and they're the last one to actually get any benefit from it. So FSC learned very quickly when we started in Canada that we needed an extra chamber, four-chamber with equal vote. The Indigenous people in our governance at the board level and standard development group have the same voting power as the three other chambers, including the economic chamber and the social chamber for communities and the environmental chambers, including WWF and Greenpeace and others. So therefore, they always been in Canada and around the world, and now there's a new Indigenous Foundation at FSC International to develop those collaborations in countries that are very crucial and for us at FSC in the Amazon and the Congo Basin and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. But back in Canada, our new national standards that I talked about a bit earlier is totally been revamped and now implemented last year around Indigenous culture, knowledge, and promoting their rights. And it's not only in one principle as used to be, the third principle, but throughout the whole standard, even though the environmental impact, the natural range of our ecosystems that we need to preserve is using Indigenous knowledge and the conservation or preservation of the requirements of our new standard is also including the knowledge of Indigenous peoples, which is a very new in the FSC world to expand the Indigenous influence and impact on our system. So yes, it is at the center of for us at FSC to include the voice of Indigenous people here in Canada, but around the world.
Yeah, thank you for helping us understand this better. I think this is, very important that the FSC is leading in this way. I wanted to pivot a little bit and address architect Paul Lewis's question in the chat, which I think I also touched on in the introduction, which was the capacity of our global forest. And I think that everyone here is also thinking a little bit regionally, if we imagine sourcing trees from a certain region like the Northeast, these Northeastern trees will flow into cities that are located in the Northeast. This also presents a question for cities who are not located near forests. What are possible solutions there or options, let's say? So one kind of question might be, Francois, I'm curious to hear your perspective from a kind of global perspective of the mass timber material flow that's a little bit larger currently than regional zones. Do you pursue an increase in mass timber production, or are you looking to kind of stabilize the rate of growth of this industry? Growth is kind of an interesting question when we're looking at climate change, but we're also looking at population increase and, like you were describing, an increase in urban density. And this might also relate to David Tasman's question of specifically about Hudson Yards, because this was a project in New York that was connected to urban density. So I can probably answer a question about mass timber specifically in New York, but globally, how do you see this flow working from the viewpoint of FSC?
Well, there is an enormous pressure on the world's forests, and not enough is FSC certified. Our first goal is the increase not necessarily what we take away from forests in terms of harvesting, but to increase our footprint of the current situation of FSC certified forests to ensure they're coming from responsible sourcing. And in many parts of the world, the first stop of wood of trees being harvested is in the sawmill to produce timber, and the residuals are going to the other sectors that are dissolving pulp for clothing or for market pulp for tissue or packagings and paper, pulp and paper products. But the first stop of the trees we harvest is for solid wood. So we need to have a good hold of that sector to be FSC certified. And we're not talking about growth here, it's just to expand our footprint. But to answer to your question, there's a limit. There's a limit of what we can harvest sustainably. We want to promote mass timber versus other construction material. However, the cost benefit of doing that is gauged against the ecosystem services and the integrity and the resiliency we want to preserve in the forest. And 25% of the intact forests on the planet is located in my country, in Canada, and we have a duty to be a steward of that reality of these forests that have never been touched, especially the old growth on the west coast of the U.S., but also certainly in Canada. I've all heard about the Ferry Creek blockage and on the island of Vancouver, and it's a completely forbidden for any certified company with the new standard of FSC, we didn't know with the old one, to harvest old growth and an ancient forest. So there is a fine balance between the growth of this market and attach the proper value on the mass timber for future generations. It's not unlimited growth for sure, and we need it's an open conversation that's not been resolved as we speak.
Yeah, I think when we are faced with these metrics that the UN is projecting, this kind of rate of growth for new construction, 1 Manhattan's worth of floor area every 2 weeks, for the foreseeable future, there seems to be a majority of that needs to be adaptive reuse, essentially, because that amount of growth can't be sustained by a kind of renewable resource, but it also shouldn't be contributing to carbon emissions. I think that Peggy, in your presentation, you brought up this incredibly difficult concept that I think is related to this question of kind of time and forest and land value of the timber market actually supports tree and forest health when you have the right people at the table. So when the forest is sustainably managed and there is a high value for those trees, then that is when the land is not returned to agriculture or urban development. And you brought up this great Harvard study. Would you like to speak a little bit more about that concept in the region that you're focusing on?
Yeah, sure. In the context slightly broader, I see it as going forward, we have really no alternative to not consider renewable resources. If we continue working with steel and concrete, we're really doing ourselves a great injustice. So the research that Chandra and Anyale have been working on, talking about new hybrids, new species, all kinds of next generation products are critical with renewable materials, not just wood. If we start thinking about bamboo, and there was a question in the chat that talked about whether or not bamboo is mass timber, I could answer that quickly right now. It's not, in fact, because it's not scaled to the size that's large enough to be considered heavy timber in the code. For beams, for example, it has to be at least 6 inches wide by 8 inches deep. The engineered bamboo that's being produced, no matter where you are in China, South America, or even the US, Bamboo is the company who's making it here. They're more 2x4s, maybe 2x6s now. So that doesn't cut it. But in terms of using new species and looking into alternative renewable resources, even hemp and flax fiber, these are really high modulus materials that could be better explored for the building market. So your question regarding concrete, no, what was it again?
No, it's okay. I'm glad you answered the bamboo question. That's very clear. I was curious, it's difficult, it's sometimes difficult to wrap your head around the fact that an increased timber market would actually protect the forest.
Right, exactly. So yeah, the market incentives that put eyes on the forest, in my way of thinking, will eventually help make sure that forests stay as forests. Right now in the Northeast region, we've lost a lot of mills because of the closure of the paper mills, especially in Maine. And I've been told by foresters that the forest industry is in a state of decline. We used to have a very vibrant forest industry because of furniture production, but that has dwindled as well. So in regions of Canada, I know there's Crown land, and we have quite different situations here with privately owned, family-run forests. But what we're trying to do here is reach out to the mill owners, the landowners, and have foresters help guide these family-run forests to better manage their forests. And that includes cutting down some of the more valuable species to be turned into either lumber or even potentially mass timber, making them aware that it's sometimes better to be cutting down some of their trees to and clear out brush. And I think it was Chandra who said, protect the forest from potential future forest fires because of pest infestations. The eastern hemlock in particular was a species that we were interested in because it's being attacked by the hemlock woolly adelgid. And this bug, what it does is takes the sap from the tree and leaves it standing dead. And it can stand there for 5 to 8 years, but then in a windstorm, it'll blow down and become fuel for hazardous fuel for forest fires. So we want to salvage wood in that respect.
And I wanted to add to the response. You know, part of the kind of burgeoning mass timber industry requires an ability to show demand. Mm-hmm. And with that demand, then either clients or developers or whoever can start to kind of make their own demands about what they want to see with regard to kind of the sourcing of the wood. And so when we started, Framework, there was a lot of pressure on that project to be FSC certified at the time. And when we, without even having a manufacturer that was making CLT, right? Mm-hmm. And then when we started getting into the details of that, in order to get that FSC certification, we'd have to go to California instead of Oregon. And we were, trying to be a very Oregon economy centric project. And so we were sort of caught between, do you have more carbon footprint from bringing it all the way up from California or, and it was at the end of the day, what we really needed is a demonstration project that actually got built that showed the demand. And it's exactly what happened. A couple of years later, I've heard of large tech companies now coming in and saying, I want, 100 million board feet of FSC certified wood. We couldn't have gotten to that point. And when they say that, guess what happens? It happens, right? Mm-hmm. Because of who they are. But we couldn't have got to that point without a project like Framework, which was like, this is not it's not perfect in every way, but it's demonstrating demand. So I'm just a big proponent of each thing being incrementally better. And sometimes you can push the industry further in sustainability, sometimes you can't. But I agree with Peggy that the wood is a much better alternative, and we can make progress within our industry if we keep talking about it, mm-hmm. But also encouraging projects that don't meet all the requirements that we all believe it should eventually.
Yeah, I'm glad you jumped in. I think just one quick note about New York. New York is it's moving forward. There are two things to mention. Internationally, CLT has been tested to work at 18 stories. New York has just approved CLT very recently in the last few months for not that high, but a kind of medium height. So their Woodworks is a great source if you're interested in getting into the details of specifically the New York market. But because individual cities adopt different versions of IBC and there's a lot of kind of nuance there, that's one of the kind of difficulties is each city has a different way of approaching some of these structures. So I wanted to conclude, I know we're a little bit over time, but I wanted to check in with each of you before we are done for the evening with what you kind of imagine the next 50 to 100 years to look like. And I think that there's a little bit of a precarious kind of question because of such unknowns on our planet and in our industry, and the kind of questions of degrowth potentially, super urbanization, or this kind of change in materiality. So I'm kind of curious, or the change in knowledge and the distribution of knowledge. I think that's a kind of awesome thing to think about moving forward too. So maybe we can go actually in the same order. Francois, do you want to kick us off with your vision for the future?
Well, my vision and the vision of FSC for the long term is to become a platform, a neutral platform for to convene all interested in forest to maintain, as Peggy said, the forest as forest. So we do certify products, but I think we will produce as we go solutions that will, I think, preserve and promote nature-based solutions, and to really put a value on intactness of our forests, and in all kinds of values it provides. It provides clean water to watershed and to large urban areas. Provides obviously the kind of sequestration of carbon, provides the air we breathe, and all kinds of values. And this is not properly valued when it comes to maintain those the intactness of our forests. And there will be this always there, I think, when we get to that point, an opportunity to say, well, extracting products from this forest will mean that at the get-go we will have to invest in high-value forest products that will go through the circular economy. And then I think there was a question about the old growth between being recycled into the supply chain, and if it's okay or not. Of course it is okay. It's much better to do that than to include virgin fiber in the system. So I think that's the future that we can envisage. Is will become a platform to solutions from which products will be only one of them.
Fantastic. Peggy, what is your vision for the future?
Maybe two fronts, research and education. I would hope that research is going to continue to push boundaries, and we'll try to overcome some of the additional concerns that we have about using wood with connections and going taller. Not that we necessarily have to go taller, and tall timber is all the buzzwords these days, but really the sweet spot for timber is anywhere between the 6 to 12 story, maybe 15 story, if you ask me. But in terms of education, we do have a lot of work still to do with that, particularly with regards to the engineering folk. I belong to the American Society of Civil Engineering's Wood Education Committee for the longest while. And having done surveys, we know that less than 50% of the engineering schools have any curricula related to upper level engineering design of timber. And that's a critical obstacle to overcome with some of these larger buildings. So I'm going to say, go out on a limb, and pardon the pun, really hope that ABET and some of the large, bigger agencies see the demand that architects and even the general public want to have more timber in their structures, and alter the curriculum slightly so that we get more, not just one course, but 2 courses in timber engineering, which will then actually bring in more graduate students and build the expertise at the faculty level to do more research in timber engineering.
That's a great projection. I love that. Anjali, what is your vision for the future?
I think, one of them, because it's such a new industry in the United States, it really provides the opportunity to create more equitable outcomes. If we were just starting from scratch in some ways, wouldn't it be amazing if through that process, we start to develop equity goals that change the nature of how we talk about sustainability to be sort of what it was intended to be. So that would be amazing. I'm really excited about, more sustainable building products, like different products like insulation. I just saw something on wood fiber insulation, extend that throughout every product in the building. I think that'd be pretty amazing. And then, you know, because of the technical nature of these buildings and how they have to be fitted and kind of very precise, in some ways it lends toward more beautiful spaces. And the kind of biophilic nature of the wood and how it makes you feel and the quality. So in some ways that aesthetic starts to translate to health and wellness and feelings of well-being in a building. And so I hope it leads to actually better design buildings as a standard. That would be nice.
And healthier people. Yeah, that's a great goal. Chandra, what is your vision? Sure.
My vision for the future is really that all the buildings are hybrids. There's wood in there, even if it's just for aesthetics, for a beautiful space for people to be in. That's where we're going, right? Lots of folks now have done one mass timber building, right? And some folks have done many, we've done many. And so I think that as we go forward, it's going to be that sort of iteration, changing it, making it better, making things more efficient. And, you know, this research work that we're doing, I think in the future, I hope in the future that more people who are doing this work are reaching out and sharing it, because really it's not proprietary. Like, I want everyone to know where to find sustainable wood. And I want everyone to know that it doesn't take a giant company to build a little building. It can be a small minority owned contractor that's in your city, right? So I want to know that, you know, in the future, people are taking more chances on people who are in their community and really growing the industry for everyone, so that everyone has the chance to participate and feel connected to it. And that really will improve the market and the climate, right? The literal climate for the future.
Fantastic. I feel full of optimism and enthusiasm. So thank you, all of you, for joining this evening. Thank you, Carson. Thank you, MoMA, for hosting, and the Emilio Ambas Institute. This has been a fantastic evening with all of you. And thank you, everyone, for joining and for including your questions. I guess that we'll say, have a good evening.
Same to you. Thank you.
You.
Bye.
Bye-bye.